Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I am with Dr. M.R. Rajagopal, the chairman of Pallium India, a trust that is devoted to looking after people, palliative care, and especially in this time of COVID, a lot of issues around death and dying and grief, and we'll come to that. And I'm with Ken Ross, a photographer in Phoenix, Arizona, in the US, the son of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross, a very well-known Swiss-American scientist, psychiatrist, really, who worked in the area of grief, about death and dying. And I'm very happy that both of you have joined me here in ThePrint. Welcome, Dr. Rajagopal, and welcome, Ross.
Thank you.
So I'm talking to you on the occasion of the death or the passing away of your mother, Ken, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross. But really, this is such an international subject, death, dying, grief. I mean, it's a story that constantly accompanies us, especially in this time of the coronavirus pandemic. So your first thoughts, Dr. Rajagopal, you're in Kerala. You are the head of this foundation and you run this palliative care trust. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this subject.
COVID-19 is an amplifier of health-related suffering. Our business of palliative care is about management of serious health-related suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Why I said it amplifies and concentrates suffering is just within a matter of few days, somebody gets sick, torn away from the family in the most traumatic way, isolated from that point, and unless the person recovers, never to be seen again. No chance to see a loved one again. No chance to say final farewell. No chance to receive a kiss on the cheek from a child or a grandchild. And for the family who will be left behind, that is what we call the worst kind of death.
Right.
Resulting in what we call complicated grief or pathological grief.
Mm-hmm.
Ordinarily, death comes over a period of time for 90% of us. It is suffering, but the family has time to get used to the thought. But here, there is no time for that adaptation. And especially, this becomes relevant in our culture now, or the global culture now. 2 generations back, death was not a stranger. Children grew up with death around them. Today, with the nuclear families and globalization, death is a stranger. For the medical system, over just 1 generation, death has become the enemy to be fought at all costs.
Mm.
We don't understand that. We can't cope with it.
Yeah.
This is particularly the relevance of the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross, Ken's mother.
Mm-hmm.
She found that people were suffering and nobody was caring. And she started trying to understand the grieving process. Her 5 stages of grief are so famous, but I leave Ken to talk about them. What we do is to prevent suffering as much as possible.
Right.
Treat suffering, pain, breathlessness, anything that goes with any disease, including COVID, and to continue to support the family through the grief.
Sure. So Ken, can I bring you into our conversation here and ask you, you're a photographer, you live in the heart of America. In your meetings with people, when you photograph people, what are your thoughts? After all, the end of life is something that's inevitable for each of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, how do you cope with sort of death, dying, and crisis around you?
Well, if you can imagine, both my parents were doctors growing up. So strangely, I heard about death and dying every single dinner of my life practically, because my parents as doctors would talk about their work. And so growing up at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, they're talking about death at every dinner. So I grew up hearing it, which was very dramatic for a child, but it certainly helped me later in life because having heard and been exposed to death, meeting dying people who were my age, 10 and 12 years old, I decided that life was short and precarious for some people, and I needed to go out and live the most fun life I could possibly have. So I decided being a photographer would be a great way to spend this beautiful existence on Earth, seeing different cultures and learning about life, out meeting tribal people, climbing mountains and so forth. I thought that was the best way to really try to understand life. And so it's been a wonderful experience. I've photographed 100 countries. And after my mom passed, I decided it was time to kind of pay back a life that had been very generous to me. So I decided to start the foundation and continue my mom's legacy.
But when you talk about continuing your mother's legacy and the 5 stages of grief Dr. Rajagopal spoke about, tell us a little bit about that in the US. Do people understand the concept of death and dying? Because America is, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's the pursuit of life and happiness, isn't it? So is that
Right.
a contradiction in terms?
Well, I think in some ways nothing has changed in 50 years because unfortunately the media and doctors, medical society, they all kind of promise you that technology was kind of going to save you and prevent death and put it far off in the distant future. But the truth is that we all die and people still don't want to talk about it. They're still in denial of death. And so while the stages are very popular, they're popular in media and so forth, it's okay to see somebody get a shot in a movie. They could talk about that death, but they can't talk about the real death, like how
Why
it
do you
really,
think? Why do you think that's true?
People just don't want to think about death. They think technology will save them. They don't face it like they used to face it. Back in the old days, death was a part of our society. If someone died, we'd go to a neighbor's house, we'd say goodbye, we'd see the body. And now death is hidden off in hospitals, in old age homes. People just stick the dying and the older people away because they don't want to see them. It's a denial of death. It's the same thing that was happening 50 years ago, unfortunately. We have better systems, we have better hospice, we have palliative care, but it's still a problem.
Right. Dr. Rajagopal, first of all, tell me about these 5 stages of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross's whole work on death, dying, and grief.
To speak on behalf of Ken's mother, the 5 stages are not written in stone in that order for everyone to happen to. It may be variable. It may not happen in that order, but to a lot of people it happens. And you will be familiar, each one of you listening to us will be familiar with your immediate reaction to loss. This cannot be true. This cannot be happening. I haven't lost my relative somewhere, and you keep looking for it. You keep looking for a solution that will take the death away, that denial. Some people get stuck there. The next one is anger. The anger is against God and death, but God and death are not in front of you to get angry with. You get angry with your spouse, at the doctor, at the nurse. Doctor, you told me that it could be an ulcer 2 weeks back. You have wasted 2 weeks of time, and now you have destroyed me. The anger against God comes out against whoever is around you. Then comes the bargaining phase. The bargaining can be with God. God, I'll make such and such offering.
That sounds so familiar, doesn't it? That all of us bargaining with God, promising to save our loved ones, because it's really like a last, God is like a last resort, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And you are then asking God for unrealistic things like no death.
Yeah.
But bargaining also can manifest in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
You go from Ayurveda to homeopathy to allopathy, back to Ayurveda. You go around searching for answers everywhere. Then comes depression, the intense grief.
Yeah.
Can, in some people, go on to the state of a disease. And the fifth is acceptance.
Acceptance, right.
That indeed is the healthiest thing in the sense, okay, so I have it. What's the best way in which I can spend the remainder of my life? What unfinished business? What do I need to do? Whom do I need to call? I must see so and so. Can my daughter's wedding be brought forward?
Yeah.
You think about solutions when you come to acceptance.
What do you think, Ken, about, I'm particularly struck by the phase of the bargain, the bargain with God, for example, for lack of a better word, or, an unseen power that if we want to conjure up. What do you make of it?
Well, bargaining is very common. The problem with bargaining is that, say you're bargaining, if you can just live 3 more months, I'll die peacefully. But rarely does I find a patient actually keep that bargain, because if they live 3 more months, they want another 3 months and then another 3 months. So the bargaining is kind of an artificial stage while they're assimilating, the information. So the bargaining is really, it's a part of the process, but it's rarely truthful, because we always want more time.
Yeah. So Dr. Rajagopal, the whole idea of dying, I mean, in Hinduism at least, and I'm not that familiar with the Christian tradition, but, in North India, where in Banaras, for example, where you have the Manikarnika Ghats and the other Ghats, where death is such a constant and it's in your face, right? It's not separated in a cremation ground, because the cremation ground is right there on the Ghats, on the river, and you come into contact on a daily basis, on an hourly basis with people who are being cremated. So this whole distancing from death and its associated grief, how did that happen?
So I really believe it happened over 2 generations, when our system of education changed, when we became more and more globalized and civilized. And
that's an interesting word to use. Are you saying it in a derogatory way?
Yeah. I mean, modern civilization means you acquire more and more possessions. You stop bothering about your neighbor, and if they are screaming in pain, you may at best call a helpline number. You don't walk across and see what they need.
Right.
I mean, that's the reality, and that change also resulted in a death-denying society. We think about it. While at one time our fatalism might have actually prevented treatment of curable diseases, now it's preventing us from accepting the fact that every one of us has to die someday.
Right.
In Bhutanese culture, they were the happiest people in the world.
Yeah.
Global Happiness Index. They have to think about their own death 5 times every day. From the time they are adolescents, they are reminding themselves, I am a mortal being. I must live today as well as possible. That is really the reminder that we need about our own mortality, making the best of the time that we have here.
Yeah. Ken, tell me about how things are in America these days with the pandemic. And do you come across people? Have you met people who who have passed? And how are people responding to the grief and to the death that is around them all the time?
Well, unfortunately, in America, it's become very politicized. So basically, you have half the country kind of saying they don't want to wear masks and kind of in denial, and half the country wearing masks, and everyone's very confused because there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of confusing information, a lot of contradictory information. So really, nobody has a good understanding of what's happening. I've known about 20 people who've caught the virus. 2 have died so far. They were older people. Surprisingly, some people I know who had cancer made it through just fine. One had a heart operation, one had a compromised immune system. So I am seeing some good news, but obviously there's a lot of people dying, and it's just very confusing. It's really out of control. I think in Arizona we have about 180,000 people now who have the virus. You know, for one state, that's just
Wow.
incredible. I think they really missed a lot of opportunities to contain this, unlike some other countries. But the problem is there's just too much bad information out there, and nobody knows who to believe.
So the confusion is adding to the grief?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the kind of grief people are experiencing is really anticipatory grief or preparatory grief, as my mother would say. They're, you know, you think, you know, you live a life and death is going to be far off in a distant time in your old age, but with the virus, I mean, anybody can get it at any time. So it's forcing people to deal with this fear of death now, no matter what your age. If you're young, middle-aged, everyone is having to face this fear of death. And that's adding, you know, to the confusion and to people being in denial and angry and all the 5 stages.
But that's interesting. And this is a question to both of you. If the pandemic is forcing us to confront our own mortality, isn't that a good thing?
Yes, I think it is. Everything has 2 sides to it. Certainly, the pandemic is a horror. It's horrible. It causes so much of suffering. The one thing that it has done, at least to force some people to think about that.
Right.
Sorry, Ken.
What do you say, Ken? Do you think that, you know, isn't it a good thing being confronted with your own mortality?
Well, my mother would say it's a great thing. She would say, you know, life is, you're meant to learn lessons, and this is a great time for us all to stop, put everything down, stop being distracted by all the toys and things in life, and focus on quality and focus on introspection. And so she would say it's a wonderful thing, but unfortunately, you know, people are not seeing it that way, and they don't like being forced to deal with it, you know. But unfortunately, there's no great way to deal with it. If you don't want to do it, you know, the pandemic is not going to make you do something you don't want to do. You're just going to react in one of these stages that's not a healthy way. So it is healthy and it's not healthy both at the same time.
But I'm curious that the two of you, you know, Dr. Rajagopal and yourself, Ken, are linked across continents. And, you know, Dr. Rajagopal, you're in deep Kerala, and Ken, you're in the heart of the US. So how do you, Dr. Rajagopal, how have you dealt with it, or how have your patients in palliative care, how are they dealing with it?
Jyoti, that brings up one issue that we still have not talked about. The suffering around us is more because of the lockdown and the restrictions, the
Right.
loss of jobs, not enough to eat. And for people with cancer and hypertension and diabetes and 100 things, especially vulnerable people like people with disabilities, the elderly living alone,
Yeah.
the people with different sexual orientations, those who are immunocompromised. It is absolute hell. That's one aspect of this we have to think about. The health system has to think about. The other thing, what's good about it, it has brought out some of the weaknesses of the healthcare system to the fore. If only we dare to see it. See, over 2 generations, healthcare becomes so disease focused that we do not bother about suffering. 98% of Indians cannot even have access to basic pain relief or treatment of breathlessness. That's not even taught in medical schools.
Right.
And we not only do not treat suffering, we add to suffering. I'm not dramatizing things. I'm stating a fact that in 1 year, 55 million Indians are pushed below poverty line with catastrophic health expenditure. 55 million, 4% of our population or more. By treatment costs, and that's growing. And what happens to the dying? How would you like to die when the time does come? Would you like the family around you? Would you like to say a final farewell? Would you like to receive a farewell kiss? And what happens now? If you have any money in the pocket, you are subjected to a violent death, in isolation in intensive care units with physical, emotional, and social suffering.
So have the two of you thought about this any further? You know, I'm actually very hesitant to ask this question, but it's a personal one and perhaps an invasive one. But Ken, do you talk about this with your friends and your
I have a
family?
lot of friends come to me to ask, what my feelings are about grief and how they deal with family members who've caught COVID. And, as my mother would say, we have to talk about death and dying before, it's too late, because once you're in the hospital with COVID and you can't see your family members, it's too late. So the time to talk about grief, about life, about finding meaningfulness, unconditional love is now. So I tell people, don't wait, until someone's sick to talk about, your final wishes. Talk about things now, because now is all we have. We don't know if we're going to be one of the unlucky ones that, even though I'm healthy and catch COVID, maybe I won't have a good response to it. So really the time to face everything is right now, especially when we're locked in our houses. It's time for some introspection, and not enough people are doing that, unfortunately.
Do you miss your mother a lot, especially these days? You think of her a lot?
I think of her a lot, but I also talk about her every day through the foundation. So, and fortunately for me, I have, hundreds of videos of my mother speaking. So I really feel her presence, and I feel her legacy, and her teachings everywhere in the world. And I go around the world meeting people who just loved Elizabeth and talk about her like she was here today. So that really is very inspirational for me.
Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting that you just said, because my sister's daughter passed away some years ago, and she was very young. She was 31 years old, Rohini. And my sister talks about her a lot, so we never really feel that she passed in the way that she did, which was, there was a lot of grief associated with it. So perhaps what I'm trying to say and trying to ask is talking about it one way to help oneself. What do you think, Dr. Rajagopal?
Absolutely. Talking about death is really talking about life. When you confront your mortality in your mind, you have to live better. The desperate desire to change your OD and get a Mercedes makes, before that you ask, is that really the most important thing now? So remember, when we dare to talk about death, we are daring to think about the value of life and living a good life.
The value of death, is that something that we should, what does that mean?
I'm actually part of a commission for a current Lancet commission on the value of death.
Mm-hmm.
We all know this. We have scriptures talking about the horrors of a world without death. This is essential. And the value of death is also, I'll repeat, about the value of life till that point of time. It's about dying a good death with as much of peace and comfort as possible, and as much of love coming to you and giving love as much as possible. But it's also about living a good life till then. So what do we need to do? Certainly what you said. Ken must have done this numerous times. Death over dinner. You have a dinner party just to discuss death. And remember, when we organized a program in Thiruvananthapuram called "Come and have a cup of tea and let us talk about death," you wouldn't believe it. Hundreds of people flocked into the hall. It was full. There were standees there. A lot of people are thinking about it, especially those who have gone through the death of a loved one, especially that traumatic, violent death in an ICU. They think about it. And unless the public discourse happens, and this is why what you're doing is particularly important, Jyoti. Unless there is public discussion about it, policies will not change.
What do you think, Ken? Death over dinner? I mean, that sounds like something that's really out of science fiction or something. You know, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it was started by a friend of mine, Michael Hebb, up in Seattle.
Oh, you mean it's something real? There is
Oh,
something.
yeah, it's real. Oh, yeah, there's
Okay, I thought
books,
it was just something
about
that
it.
Rajagopal was conjuring up.
Oh, no, it's a big group. It's a worldwide group now. They have chapters all over the world, and they've had, I think, hundreds, maybe even thousands of dinners now. They also have death cafes, which are small, more informal, and they have those all over the world as well. We do those in France and Europe.
It sounds really morbid.
It's great because it's a casual setting. You're not forced to speak, and so people can kind of bite it off like small bite-sized pieces, not have it in your face, but you can just be watching it, or you can participate, or I've seen them, and one person talks, and then it makes another person kind of pop and want to share their story, and it's a good setting because it's casual, it's not medical, it's not too personal, it's just it has the right atmosphere. It's hard to say, but something about it really works.
Right. It's like a mass memorial meeting or something, but you don't necessarily meet people but even strangers, and you're sharing grief, right?
You're more comfortable, right?
Yeah. So, gentlemen, any last thoughts on what people like us, ordinary people who don't come across death? And although I must say that in this time, with COVID around us, I think journalists are on the front line of people who are dying and being witness to death. But any thoughts, any last thoughts?
If I may speak,
Sure.
I think these are desperate times. Why did the World Health Assembly ask us to include palliative care in COVID? Because the suffering is horrendous and it can be dealt with, it can be treated if COVID policies include treatment of suffering. We are talking about preventing and treating suffering, the pain, the breathlessness, the emotional trauma, the pathological grief that the families live through for the rest of their lives, destroying even the next generation. This is vitally important. You said death cafes are morbid. They are indeed. If morbid is seen as a very bad word, maybe it will become more acceptable. If we accept that each one of us has to get ill someday, each one of us has to die someday, that will give us the opportunity to value life much more.
Yeah. I think so. You're normalizing morbid. Ken?
I would say my mother always found that people are afraid to die because they're afraid to live fully. And so we all should be working on living fully, because if we've lived a great life, we have nothing to fear going into our death, because we've done everything we can. We've found meaning. We found our path. We've shared unconditional love. And so my mother would say that in finding health and balance, we will have a good death. And we find health by focusing on four things: the emotional, the intellectual, the physical, of course, and the spiritual. She said when those four quadrants are in balance, then we're a healthy person. And that's how we have to treat patients and ourselves, using those four quadrants. And when we can excel at those four quadrants, then we can have a good death.
That's such a beautiful thought. Those four quadrants that you're talking about, actually so familiar, but something that we must actively, I think, embrace. But thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. It's, death is something that's always at the back of your head, right? Like a shadow that follows you all the time, but you don't want to meet your own shadow. But thank you so much to the Elizabeth Kubler Ross Foundation for talking about this, to Dr. Rajagopal in Kerala, for your care with patients, your palliative care institution. Thank you so much for your time, and it's at ThePrint. Please do write to us to connect with us and and give us ideas, tell us what you think about our work. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Raj.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you
very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.